They say there are places where the earth breathes memories that time could not delete, places where the stones seem to carry a silence so ancient that, when you touch them, something inside us awakens, as if the soul recognizes a story that the mind still can't understand. And maybe you've already felt this. That strange feeling that certain encounters, certain signs, are not coincidence. If you feel that there's something calling to you, then maybe this video is just what your journey needed to hear. Imagine walking along the slopes of the Caucasus at dawn, when the sun touches the mist and reveals, little by little, structures so ancient that they defy not only archaeology, but the very memory of humanity. Colossal megaliths where they shouldn't exist, brands recorded with impossible precision for the estimated period, aligned stone portals with stars that, millennia ago, occupied different positions in the sky. Who put them there, and why? For a long time we were told that these alignments were pure chance, that the brands they were just natural grooves in the rock. But the more scholars look, the more they realize that there is a pattern, a kind of code left behind. As if someone, long before us, he wanted to record something that could not be forgotten, something that it would survive even when entire civilizations disappeared. The Caucasus is a geological, spiritual, and historical gateway. There, colossal mountains rise as guardians of secrets that predate the emergence of the first cities known humans. There, ancient people spoke of gods who came down through the mountains, masters who taught astronomy, healing arts, mathematics, and reading the sky. And, interestingly, many of these traditions mention the same symbol, marks left on the stones to indicate the passage of these beings, brands that are still there. And the most intriguing thing is that, when you look closely at the megaliths, something repeats itself. Parallel lines burned into the rock, perfectly circular depressions, patterns identical geometric patterns in regions separated by tens of kilometers. It's not erosion. It's no coincidence. It's a message. What would happen if these marks were, in fact, records of knowledge lost ancestor? What if they were evidence that advanced civilizations existed long ago, before what we call the beginning of history? Maybe we are not facing ruins, but in front of signs. Signs that we've been here before. Signs that something, or someone, wanted us to remember. And as you listen to this story, I invite you to pause silently within yes. Because the megaliths of the Caucasus don't just talk about the past. They talk about us, about the part of the soul that seeks meaning in everything that seems impossible, about the intuition that whispers that there is more, much more than we have been taught to believe. And then the question that opens this portal arises. What if the marks on the stones are the key to something that humanity has not yet? Are you ready to admit it? If something inside you has begun to awaken, stay with me. The answer may be in the next block. The origin of megaliths and the mystery that doesn't want to be explained. There are places in the world that don't look like they were built. They look like they were remembered, as if the earth itself had shaped its surface to hold a secret that could not be forgotten. The megaliths of the Caucasus belong to that kind of place. They appear abruptly between valleys, chasms, and slopes unreachable, like monuments that defy the logic of the civilizations that supposedly lived there. It is as if someone, long before known people, had shaped these mountains with an intention that remains alive, even if misunderstood. When you approach the first structures, you notice that they do not follow a familiar architectural pattern. They are not simple dolmens nor burial chambers, are pieces of a vast and silent puzzle. The rock was cut with precision, millimetric, and many of these structures are integrated into the relief itself, as if following an invisible map drawn by the underground veins of the mountain, by the alignments of the stars, or by some energy field that we do not yet know how to measure. Nothing in that landscape looks random. Nothing seems to have been left to chance. For the people who inhabited the region thousands of years ago, these stones were not just constructions, they were signs. They were the points where the sky touched the earth, where the spirit of an ancestor, a master, or a god could descend. There, according to traditions, the mountains spoke, and it is impossible to ignore that these megaliths hold a power symbolic that transcends the simple act of lifting stones. There are marks, there are angles, there are cavities oriented towards constellations that today are no longer in the same position. This means that whoever built these monuments had an astronomical precision that we are only now beginning to decipher it. The archaeologists, in the face of this, try to offer explanations that sound more like assumptions rather than conclusions. They say it could be a cult of the dead, or a rudimentary form of sanctuary. But how can you justify such perfect cuts in such hard rock, without advanced metal tools? How to justify blocks weighing tens of tons moved on sloping terrain, where even modern machines would not have easy access today? No, there are old roads. There are no tool residues. There is no robust cultural layer that indicates a people large enough to produce this type of work. It's as if the builders showed up, did what they needed to do, and disappeared without leaving a trace. And this is where the revelation that disturbs everyone who studies the Caucasus begins. These megaliths seem older than the human settlement of the region itself. This means that they were probably erected before the arrival of cultures known, even before the emergence of the first Neolithic villages. And when a structure is older than the established human presence itself, two questions inevitably arise. Who built it, and how? When these questions emerge, something inside us moves. Because the truth is that for centuries we have been conditioned to believe that human history began little time, that we came from a simple and linear line of evolution. But what if this is linearity, a comfortable illusion? And if there are entire chapters of the history of humanity that were removed, forgotten, or buried by events that did not, can we imagine more? The megaliths of the Caucasus seem to point precisely towards this direction, a period before historical record, before myths, before time itself as we count it today. And there is another fascinating detail: the energy of the place. It doesn't matter who visits. People sensitive, objective researchers, curious, all report the same sensation. It's as if the air vibrated. It's like I'm being watched by something, benign but present. It's as if the stone had a memory. This subjective perception may seem irrelevant in an archaeological study, but it is not. Throughout human history, places considered sacred have this characteristic, a kind of energetic field that precedes the rational explanation. And when that feeling is shared by so many, it starts to seem less coincidence and more clue. Then a curious paradox arises. The more science studies these structures, the more you realize how much you don't know how to explain them. And the more spiritual traditions observe them, most recognize in them symbols common to other ancient cultures spread around the world. This creates an uncomfortable mirror for our understanding of antiquity. Everything that we thought we knew was perhaps only a small part of the truth. And this is where emotional synthesis begins to form within us. Because megaliths, they are not just old stones. They are invitations. Invitations to remember that the past is not a straight line. It's a circle, an echo, a return. And perhaps upon understanding who left these marks, we can also understand who we are, where we came from, and what we are destined to find again. Now I ask you a question that opens the next portal. What if these megaliths are not just traces of the past, but messages left for our time? The hidden marks and ancestral symbolism engraved in stone. As we get closer to these structures, we begin to realize that it is not just the grandeur of the megaliths is intriguing. It's what's engraved on them. Brands so subtle, so precise, so repeated, in places separated by entire mountains, that they make them impossible to ignore. They are parallel lines that appear to have been burned in the stone. They are grooves that maintain the same depth for long meters. Are circles perfect that could not have been made with rustic tools? Are symbols that evoke a lost language? A type of writing that is not read with the eyes but with the intuition. What is impressive is the recurrence. The same marks appear on isolated dolmens, on megalithic chambers, in elevated blocks that defy human physics at the time. It's like if a single hand had signed the entire region, leaving repeating patterns as if they were instructions, codes, or reminders for future generations. Many scholars, when analyzing these marks, they note that they do not correspond to natural erosion patterns. Erosion is chaotic. These marks are coherent. And coherence is something that only exists when there is intention. When we analyze the recordings with grazing light, what seemed like irregularities turns into a drawing, the shape of an incomplete spiral, an elongated rhombus, of a three-pointed star. These symbols are not common in known cultures of the region, but appear in similar form in spiritual sites around the world. A spiral, for example, is seen as a symbol of the soul, time, and the eternal journey of the spirit in peoples who have never had contact with each other. And when a universal symbol emerges etched in stone in a remote place in the Caucasus, the question inevitably arises: who was teaching what to whom? There is also a special type of mark that intrigues researchers. Small holes circular, too perfect to be simple natural cavities. In some stones they align as if they were coordinates. In others they draw possible maps, paths between mountains, astronomical directions. Their diameters are almost identical, suggesting the use of a tool. Not a rough stone tool, but something capable of rotating, drilling, and polishing with precision. Where did such technology come from? And why that someone would have invested so much effort to leave that kind of mark in such a isolated? But there is something even more intriguing than technology: symbology. The ancient people, they believed that the stones were portals. Therefore, they inscribed symbols to open or protect these portals. In the Caucasus, many of these symbols are repeated around narrow passages, as if they marked specific points where the veil between worlds was thinner. And when we put these markings in perspective with the position of the sun and stars, we see patterns that coincide with solstices, equinoxes, and constellations linked to creation myths. None of this seems like an accident. Everything seems part of a spiritual spirit that understood heaven and earth as parts of the same body. There are researchers who believe that these marks represent a primitive form of energetic writing, not letters but signals to amplify or channel frequencies. Can seem fanciful at first glance, but when we observe that brands are always positioned at points where the rock vibrates differently, as if they were antennas nature of the terrain, the hypothesis begins to gain strength. Maybe the ancients weren't just logging messages. Maybe they were activating something. Maybe the stones functioned as instruments that echoed what the soul needed to hear. And this is where the narrative becomes even deeper, because these brands are not just symbols engraved on the outside. Many of them appear inside cameras' megalithic structures, in places where light barely penetrates, in points where no one would see the drawing unless it was in absolute silence, following a ritualistic path. This indicates that the marks were not meant to be seen by everyone. They were to be found at the right time, by someone who was ready to understand them, as if the stones contained messages intended for initiates, or perhaps for us now. But there is a paradox that breaks any easy explanation. These brands follow a pattern reminiscent of modern diagrams. There are proportions based on numbers that we recognize today as the golden ratio. There are angles that correspond to division's precise mathematics. How would a prehistoric people have mastered such concepts? And more, why would they apply this knowledge precisely to rocks set in mountains distant? Emotional interpretation is inevitable. It seems that these symbols speak to the humanity directly, touching something that vibrates within all of us. A memory collective. A memory that somewhere far away, there was a language that we all knew it. A language made of form, rhythm, and light. Maybe that's why, when we look at these megaliths, we feel something familiar, not because we've seen them before, but because we've felt them before. And then comes the unexpected turn, when we superimpose the marks of the Caucasus on those of other ancient sites. Ireland, India, Japan. We see geometric correspondences scary, as if everyone was following the same forgotten manual. What does this mean? That there was a mother civilization? That there was a common teacher? Or that the spiritual wisdom has always found ways to repeat itself, even when people were separated by time and land? And as this puzzle forms before us, one question remains that echoes gently between the stones. What if these marks are not just records of the past, but instructions left for when humanity was ready to awaken? Scientific, acoustic, and geological interpretations. When the stone speaks one language that science still does not translate. At first glance, many believe that the megaliths of the Caucasus are just formations' natural shapes shaped by time. This is the most comfortable explanation, the simplest, the one that keeps the world within the predictable boundaries of our theories. But just one exam pay more attention so that this simplicity begins to crumble. Researchers who analyzed these structures with modern instruments discovered patterns that completely contradict the idea of a random process. The rock has cuts precise, symmetrical angles, flat surfaces that stretch for meters, and depressions uniforms, as if they had been scraped off by a tool a tool that should have existed at that time. When geologists tested the rock's hardness, they found an even greater paradox. Many of the structures are made of granite, an extremely resistant and difficult to break material, sculpted even with current technology, and yet the cuts look so smooth like blades passing through warm butter. How to explain this? Stone tools, they would not make such marks. Bronze tools would be destroyed immediately. Iron tools only appeared thousands of years later. It's as if someone had intense heat, vibration, or some type of technology capable of fragmenting the rock by inside without leaving visible residue. And, strangely, some of these brands actually show signs of vitrification, points where the surface of the stone appears to have melted and solidified again. From here, some scientists began to investigate the possibility of phenomena acoustics. At many ancient sites around the world, megalithic chambers have been built with specific sound properties, as if they were giant instruments. The Caucasus is no exception. When researchers emitted sound frequencies into certain structures, they found that the stone responded. Some cameras amplify vibrations so precisely that they seem to have been constructed to resonate with the human voice. In others, specific frequencies make the rock literally shake, like if she were alive. This resonance is not random. It suggests knowledge, sophisticated acoustics, rare even in much more recent cultures. But the most surprising thing was yet to come. In some megaliths, sensors have detected subtle differences in the electromagnetic field. Nothing dramatic, nothing that can be easily classified as a paranormal anomaly, but it's enough to raise questions. The stones seem to interact with the environment in an unusual way, as if absorbing energy during the day and release it slowly at night. This could be coincidence. You could be intentional. There are scholars who believe that certain minerals present in rocks function as natural batteries, accumulating solar and vibrational energy. If this is true, then perhaps the ancients knew how to take advantage of these properties, or at the same time less perceived them intuitively. And here we begin to enter a territory where science and spirituality cease to be opposite and start to complement each other. Because for many ancient people, stone was not just matter. It was memory. It was spirit. It was a body that could store stories, vibrations, and teachings. Perhaps for them, carving the rock was also carving the invisible. Perhaps it would create a bridge between the physical world and the subtle world. And, interestingly, modern science is beginning to see that certain materials can actually record vibrations, frequencies, and electromagnetic changes. What we call technology may have been for them just sensitivity. But there is a discovery that has shaken the field of studies once and for all. Modern equipment detected, in some circular marks present in megaliths, similar patterns those produced by rotating machines, such as drills. But these drills seem to have drilled into the rock with a constant and extremely uniform pressure, generating striations, spiral shapes that resemble impressions of industrial tools. The depth of cut is so precise that, according to modern engineers, it would require equipment that only appeared in recent centuries. Of course, this puts us before a dilemma, admitting that these people had advanced technology that has completely disappeared, or admit that they were not common people. And when we try to find answers, we stumble upon more mysteries. In many regions, the geometric pattern of the marks points directly to astronomical events in the past. There are alignments with stars that would only have made sense more than 10,000 years ago. This places the dating of the megaliths in a period that completely contradicts what the traditional archaeology accepted. And if these structures really are that old, then force us to rewrite entire chapters of human history. But here an important contrast emerges. On the one hand, science tries to explain everything rational way, with already known tools and theories. On the other, everything in the Caucasus seems to suggest that we are facing knowledge that goes beyond the basics. One knowledge that does not fit into conventional categories. Maybe the stones respond because they were built to respond. Maybe they vibrate because they were positioned at specific points in the Earth's crust. Perhaps they are aligned with the heaven because its builders believed or knew that everything is connected. And when this understanding begins to form, a silent feeling passes through us. What if the Caucasus is trying to remind us that science and spirit are not opposites, but parts of the same map that we forgot how to read? Spear connection current, memories of the soul, and the turns that redefine the meaning of invisible. There is a moment, when walking among the megaliths of the Caucasus, when the experience leaves from being just archaeological and becomes intimate. It's as if the silence of the valley approaches of you, as if an ancient presence whispers that what your eyes see is just the surface of something much deeper. Some call this feeling intuition, others of spiritual memory. But whatever the name, it awakens in us the certainty that the soul recognizes what history has forgotten, as if these monuments were internal doors, where each stone becomes a memory. The sensation is not abstract. Many visitors report that, in front of certain structures, they feel a sudden emotion, a gentle tightness in their chest, a sweet melancholy, as if they were meeting a friend they didn't remember losing. Modern psychologists would call this archetypal resonance, when a symbol touches a point so depth of the collective unconscious that becomes universally familiar. But the people, the ancients, had another name for this, remembering the origin. They believed that the spirit, when passing through sacred places, recognized paths taken before the birth. And somehow this explanation seems closer to the truth than rational theories that try to reduce it to a mere psychological effect. The marks engraved on the stone intensify this sensation. In different megaliths we find patterns that seem to evoke movements of the sky, cycles of life, phases of soul, spirals that rotate inwards indicating return, spirals that open, indicating expansion, parallel lines that resemble the invisible threads that connect everything that exists. When we look at these symbols in the evening light, they take on a deeper depth, unexpected, almost as if they were vibrating. And maybe they do vibrate, not in the sense physically, but in an emotional sense. Because what was done with spiritual intention, it remains imbued with meaning, even thousands of years later. This is where many scholars begin to consider the hypothesis that these monuments, they were not just buildings, but tools for the soul. Introspection portals, stone mirrors, scale models of the human being itself. The priests and wise men of the ancient cultures believed that architecture had power, not the power to protect bodies, but the power to awaken consciences. And when we analyze the geometry of Caucasian megaliths, we realize that everything seems to have been planned to guide the human experience. Channels that amplify the voice, tunnels that narrow the senses, chambers that intensify breathing. It's as if the entire structure was designed to provoke states of lucidity, contemplation, and revelation. But there is something even more surprising. When comparing Caucasian brands with brands found in other parts of the world, Andes, Japan, India, we see symbols identical, similar shapes, parallel intentions. How is this possible? Cultures separated by oceans and millennia should not have created the same codes, unless that were not separate cultures, unless there was a common origin, one primary wisdom, a spiritual tradition so ancient that it predates all civilizations known. Perhaps it was this tradition that taught the language of symbols, of stars and the soul. Perhaps she was the silent mother of humanity. And it is at this point that the mystery deepens. Because science struggles to explain why so many ancient people created similar symbols without contact with each other. But in spirituality, the answer has always been present. There is a field of memory that unites all souls. A field where ideas, images, archetypes, and memories are shared across borders. Jung called this the collective unconscious. The mystics called Akasha. The Caucasian sages called it the Book of Stone, as if the mountain itself was a living record of the spiritual history of humanity. And the more we observe these symbols, the more we realize that they do not speak of old technology. They talk about us. They are representations of what is eternal: birth, death, transformation, return, awakening. Maybe the builders weren't trying to register events, but states of the soul. Perhaps these megaliths are not historical monuments, but interior monuments, maps that show the way inside us. It is at this point along the way that I need to tell you something important. If something inside you is awakening, stay until the end. The answer can be here. This is the point in the journey when many want to turn back. because the revelation approaches, and with it, the confrontation with everything we think, we know. And it is precisely here that the turning point appears that changes everything. There is a very rare phenomenon observed by researchers. When certain brands are illuminated with specific bands of light, hidden patterns appear. Invisible lines appear on the stone as if the symbol had a second layer, a layer that only reveals itself when light and shadow match at the exact angle. This suggests that the builders knew not only the shape of the stone, but the behavior of light. They knew that visible branding serves the physical world, but the invisible mark serves the spiritual world. It's as if they were saying, the truth is here, but only those who search deeply will find it. And then emotional synthesis blooms within us like a calm flame. These symbols weren't just messages for the past, they were messages for the future, for us, for the moment when humanity looked inward again and realized which has always been connected to the invisible. When this happens, we understand that the megaliths don't hold answers. They hold questions that transform. And before we enter the next layer, I leave a question that echoes among the stones and inside the soul. What if what we call a mystery is actually the memory of who we were before forgetting? The psychological, mystical, and human implications when the stone becomes mirror and the journey becomes within. As we advance among the megaliths of the Caucasus, something curious happens, that the landscape seems to begin to reflect the interior of those who walk there, not just the mind but the core. It is as if each stone, with its marks, its corridors, its openings and its voids, mirrored parts of the human psyche, as if they were models, gigantic volumes of our emotions, our fears, our forgotten memories. Perhaps this is why so many people report a sense of recognition inexplicable, not because they know that place, but because they know what it is awakens. The stone does not speak to the intellect, speaks to the memory of the soul. This phenomenon, which could easily be dismissed as imagination, has been studied by psychologists, anthropologists, and experts in altered states of consciousness. They found that symbolic environments, especially those built with ritualistic geometry, can provoke deep responses in the human brain, activate regions linked to introspection, spirituality, and a sense of purpose. In other words, these spaces seem to have been designed to remind us of who we are when the UEO external world is silent. And this discovery creates a powerful link between science and spirituality, suggesting that ancient cultures perhaps understood, in a intuitive, what neuroscience is only now beginning to recognize. The environment shapes the state of consciousness. The people who lived in that region millennia ago spoke about places where the sky descended until it touches the human heart. They said that the stone was not just matter, was a guardian of emotional memories, that when passing through certain structures, the soul was reorganized as if it were tuned again. And this leads us to a question that may seem simple, but it is profoundly transformative. What if these megaliths were not only ancient monuments, but psychological devices? Tools created to take being human to higher states of perception, places of healing, of revelation, of inner rebirth. The hypothesis is not as unlikely as it seems. When we examine the internal geometry of certain cameras, we perceive patterns that correspond exactly to models acoustic devices used today in resonance therapies. Certain structures amplify frequencies that coincide with natural vibrations of the human body, especially those linked to the heart and solar plexus. Others create absolute silence, allowing a deep dive into one's own being. Did the ancients know this? Or did they just feel it? Maybe there was no distinction between feeling and knowing at that time. Perhaps the knowledge spiritual feeling was as natural as breathing. And then another fascinating aspect emerges: the threshold experience. Many megaliths have narrow passages that force the visitor to enter bent over, almost as if they were passing through a stone womb. Upon emerging, a lit or open chamber appears. Sky. This pattern, darkness, contraction, passage, expansion, appears in rituals of initiation from around the world. It symbolizes symbolic death and rebirth. Leave behind the old identity and emerge transformed. The Caucasian megaliths appear to have been designed exactly for this purpose, not as tombs, but as portals psychological. The most impressive thing, however, is that even non-believers or skeptics report similar sensations: an inner pause, a full emptiness, an unexpected clarity. It is as if something greater was revealing itself there, silently. Maybe because the stone is still for millennia, and anything that remains silent for that long becomes an invitation to introspection, or perhaps because the soul knows when it is in front of a portal, even when the mind tries to deny it. But it is precisely when we begin to understand these inner dimensions that a stop appears even deeper. The more we investigate, the more we realize that these megaliths seem to defy not only history and geology, but nature itself, modern psychology. They suggest that human beings have always had two journeys, the external and the internal, and that many ancient cultures mastered the inner journey with a skill that we have lost over the centuries. Today we look for answers on screens, books, theories, and formulas. But there, among the Caucasus Mountains, the answer doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside. Inside, as if the place itself were a reminder that the soul has compasses that science still doesn't understand. And then comes the reflection that touches any sensitive heart. If ancient people built spaces that arouse deep emotions, then perhaps they weren't just architects. Perhaps they were psychologists, mystics, healers. Perhaps they understood that human beings need places to remember. And if that's true, then we're not just faced with of ruins. We are facing an emotional legacy, a self-knowledge manual carved in stone. The unexpected turn happens when we realize that science begins to confirm something that the ancients already knew. The human mind is not just biology, it's landscape, and how every landscape needs internal mountains, caves of silence, megaliths, symbolic, symbols in which we can recognize ourselves. Maybe that's why so many people they feel that these monuments call. Maybe they will, not to reveal ancient secrets, but to reveal parts of us that have remained dormant. And then the emotional synthesis sets in, perceiving the megaliths not as enigmas to be resolved, but like mirrors that ask for courage. Courage to look at yourself's shadow, courage to cross your own threshold, courage to admit that there is something in us who remembers, always, where we came from, even when our words can explain. And as this understanding matures, I leave a gentle hook that opens the next journey portal. What if the true mystery of megaliths is not in the stone, but in the transformation that they provoke in those who dare listen to them? The human path, destiny, and legacy, when the riddle of the stone mixes to the enigma of existence. As we approach the end of this journey through the megaliths of the Caucasus, a perception that imposes itself, gently but inescapably. Perhaps we are not studying only old buildings, but studying ourselves. Because every mark, each silence, each alignment with the sky reminds us that human beings always sought answers to the same question: who are we within this vast mystery? And interestingly, the people who erected or preserved these monuments seemed less concerned with explaining the world and more committed to living in tune with it. Maybe that's why their stones survive while their names dissolve. In time, megaliths teach us something essential. Every civilization that forgets its own spiritual depth becomes fragile. The Caucasus reveals this to us not as a warning, but as a souvenir. There, the wind whispers stories of people who understood that life was not just survival, but meaning. That every human being is a traveler between the visible and the invisible. And as he walks, he leaves marks, some on the ground, others in the memory of those who will come after. It's impossible to look at those huge blocks of stone and not realizing that they were made to outlast their builders. They were legacies, messages for the future, silent testimonies that one day someone knew how to see beyond. But the most surprising thing is that the more we try to decipher these monuments, the more they give us questions instead of answers, as if they were ancient masters, inviting us to abandon the modern arrogance of thinking we know everything. Maybe the true learning lies in admitting that we are still crawling in front of the vastness of human history. Perhaps there are entire chapters lost, not for lack of records, but because we do not yet have the spiritual maturity to understand them, and that it completely changes the way we see ourselves within the timeline. And then comes the emotional turn that transforms our gaze. We realize that we are not here to solve an archaeological mystery. We're here to solve a mystery interior. Megaliths function as portals that bring us closer to a simple truth and profound. Humanity has always thirsted for transcendence. He always sought heaven, He always heard the silence. He always had questions bigger than his own life. And this is precisely what connects us to the unknown hands that left those marks on the stone. We don't know their names, but we know their intentions. They were also looking for something. They also walked between worlds. They also wondered about the meaning of existence. And suddenly, everything takes on another shine. The Caucasus is no longer just a place on the map and becomes a mirror of the journey humana, full of rises, falls, forgetfulness, reunions. Perhaps these megaliths are not just heirlooms. Maybe are invitations. Invitations to remember that we belong to something bigger, that there are lines, invisible links past, present, and future, and that the soul recognizes these lines even when the mind does not understand them. And so we reach the final threshold. We are about to go through the last door of this journey. And before we continue, a question echoes among the mountains and within us. What if the true legacy of these megaliths is not what they show, but what invite us to awaken? At the end of this crossing, when the wind from the Caucasus rests on the ancient stones, something inside us finally silences, not to end the search, but to understand it. Because megaliths didn't give us straight answers. They offered us mirrors. Every mark, every shadow, every impossible cut reminded us that there are paths that only can be covered with an awakened soul. And that meaning is not just in what we find, but in what we become when we search. Perhaps that is the true purpose of these structures, to remind us that we belong to a story bigger than our calendars, bigger than our theories, bigger than any human certainty. A story written not just in stone, but in space, silent between one thought and another. There, where the spirit breathes. And now, as this cycle ends, a gentle invitation opens. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. Your soul can be remembering the path, and when you look again at any ancient stone, at any trace of silence, perhaps you will realize what has always been there, hidden in plain sight. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that the soul haven't you forgotten yet?